I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, Thus Says the Lord, God Speaks Through His Servants the Prophets. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 7 of our study, which covers selections from 2nd Isaiah. In the intro here, I said we're covering sections from 2nd Isaiah. If you thought, hey, 2nd Isaiah, that's not a book in the Bible, congratulations, you know the books in the Bible. But there is an important distinction here, and there's a reason that we talk about Isaiah actually has three parts. First Isaiah, Deutero, which is just a Greek word meaning second, or second Isaiah, and Trito, same deal with third, or third Isaiah. They cover distinctly different periods in history, and were in extremely high likelihood written by different people, even though tradition has them compiled together as the book of Isaiah. Thematically, it is, even though the time periods that it addresses are different, the themes and the way that it talks about them are very similar. So it comes from kind of the same prophetic tradition and a very similar viewpoint. But that does not guarantee that it was written by one guy named Isaiah. We tend to think it probably wasn't. If you want to think it was, you also can do that. Scholarship generally will disagree with you, but there are people who hold that view as well. And that's all we'll really get into on the scholarly side of that. But for the sake of these videos, we are going to talk about this as 2nd Isaiah. It's helpful to look at this section as such, and to look at the time period in which it happened. And there's kind of a unique flavor and character to 2nd Isaiah that is just fantastic. This is like the epitome of what I think we tend to think of when we think of prophecy, Old Testament prophecy. Some of the most beautiful and often quoted sections of prophecy are from 2nd Isaiah. Some of which we'll talk about today, some of which we've addressed elsewhere in our study. But 2nd Isaiah, really cream of the crop when it comes to what is prophecy. So this is for this study, this whole 2-volume study in this project that we're trying, this is kind of a high point. Because this is good stuff. So we're in for a fun journey. What's the time period? I said they cover different time periods. First Isaiah deals with before the exile, so that's not in this volume. 2nd Isaiah is addressing something that the flavor of the message is that it is addressing the people in exile, but the theme is return. So we're beginning to shift toward and to look into this much more strongly than we have been, this idea of return. We're talking about it as inevitable and as present now in 2nd Isaiah. And 3rd Isaiah is, we'll see later, is after the return. So, we've been in exile for a while. We spent a lot of time getting there. We spent a little bit of time there. We'll spend a little bit more time there. But from a prophecy point of view, you're dealing with things in anticipation. So when you're in exile, you start to talk about the return. When you're not yet in exile, you start talking about the threat of looming exile. So prophecy anticipates history. So now we are in the period of exile, so our prophecy is talking about the period of return. When we get to the period of return, our prophecy will start to talk about what's next, which will be also very interesting, but I'm not going to spoil it now. For now, we are historically in exile. We are prophetically anticipating return. And that is a large part of what makes this so cool. We're also in the part of the cycle of these people where they are finding their way back to God. And so, likewise, the tone and narrative of prophecy turns from punishment to the first word here, comfort. It's just like when we're not doing what we should be and following God, we can correctly anticipate bad things on the horizon. When we fix that, and we fall in line, we can correctly anticipate good things on the horizon. So as the tone of some of the people is changing, the religious practice is changing, devotion is returning, piety is returning, the people are starting to look forward to the idea of what this prophecy is talking about, return. And so now the thing that is on the horizon, rather than being calamity, is a very good and uplifting thing. So, what have we got here? First word, comfort. That really sums up. There are only a few major themes here in 2nd Isaiah. That is the first one, is that God is going to restore what was lost and take the tribulations of these people and replace them with peace and comfort. That is our big theme. And the other one is going to be, as the people are living in exile, they are surrounded by people with other religious practices. So there's also going to be a theme of, hey, those other gods aren't all that and are fake. And you shouldn't worship them. You should keep worshiping me, your God. And if you can just get that one thing right, then return, right? Comfort, peace, return to Jerusalem. All that was lost can be restored and then some. Just stay the course and ignore these other gods. With a strong hint of you're doing what you need to be doing, right? The pre-exile prophecy was, if you do what you need to be doing, you can stay here, but you're not. And that's not what's going to happen. Here it's, if you do what you need to be doing, you will return and things will go well. And by and large, that is what's happening. Just avoid these few pitfalls along the way, please. And this can work out really well. So those kind of thematically are main points. There are things worth diving into here. There is my favorite issue of punctuation in the Bible. I know, punctuation, most of the time I start talking about intricacies of grammar and punctuation, I can lose some people I start glossing over. There's a line here that is quoted in the Gospels, and it's very important. It is the line that summarizes the mission of John the Baptist, and it is different in how it's interpreted in the New Testament than it is in the Old, by a matter of punctuation. And that is, a voice cries in the desert or in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. The New Testament version has the two clauses, a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, with the voice being placed in the wilderness, right? So John is out in the wilderness or the desert, and he is preparing the way of the Lord. And that's the New Testament interpretation. The Old Testament interpretation, the way this is translated, is a voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. So that the way of the Lord is in the wilderness, not necessarily the voice. And it's a comma or a semicolon, or however they end up punctuating, it differs. Remember, these ancient texts did not have punctuation. That's interpretation, that's translation. And you see here, we'll talk about both of them a little bit. We'll talk about, this study will get to the New Testament, and we can dive into some more of reinterpretation of prophecy in the New Testament when we get there. We'll tee it up a little because it's too juicy not to. But we'll do more when we get there as well, because that's where we're leading with all of this. But, so, the Old Testament version, what is this actually talking about? Not Jesus coming and John the Baptist. We know that's one obvious meaning of this prophecy, since the evangelists felt the need to, all four of the evangelists felt the need to point that out to us. They did not want us to miss that. But what does it mean here? So you are in a foreign land. You have been held, you've been held captive in exile in a foreign land. And you're starting to talk about, you're not going to stay there. You're going to go back, right? So what is the way from here in exile to there? Jerusalem. And it's not such a straight and an easy journey. The promise here is don't worry about taking a long way around when you're going back. God's going to, any hills in the way are going to get flattened, any valleys are going to get filled in, the wilderness and the dangers of that are going to be fine. Nice straight road leading right from where you are now, straight without hindrance or obstacle through the wilderness to where you're going. So the road, in the Old Testament context, the road itself very much is the thing in the wilderness, right? You are not in the wilderness. Where you're going is not in the wilderness. The place in between is, and we're going to make a nice, straight, easy road through that. A few more points that are relevant. The idea of it being a road also through a wilderness or deserty area calls to mind the Exodus, or should. This is a second Exodus. Instead of leaving captivity to Egypt, you are leaving captivity to Babylon. In either case, foreign power was oppressing the people, but it's not the same, right? We'll see later God is doing a new thing. There's a lot of similarity. It's not the same. Cyrus, king of Babylon, Persia, yes, sorry. It was Babylon. God shifts who's in charge of the people who are in charge of the Israelites as part of what he does to let them go. He interferes with politics that have nothing to do with his people as a part of helping his people. So after Persia takes over Babylon, then the people are captive in the kingdom of Persia, and at that point, Cyrus, the king of Persia, is more than happy to let the people go. Whereas, if you remember, there's the big dramatic speech, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh saying, "No, I don't think I will." And "Let my people go." "No, I don't think I will." Plagues, right? Like, there was a lot of drama there where things did not go well for the Egyptians. This is not that. This is, God is going to do a similar thing differently. This time, instead of browbeating the Persians into letting his people go, they're just going to do it. And God is going to have a very different relationship with Cyrus than he did with Pharaoh, which we'll get into throughout the study here. So it's like the Exodus, but it's not. God is not acting this time through violence. This is a peaceful thing, which is a whole other level of amazing, right? Like, it's one thing that he delivered his people by force and by his might in war, right? In the Egyptian days, that is a miraculous thing, and it kind of set the tone and the identity of the people of Israel as dominating foreign powers and war and conquest. And God was positioned as a war leader for his people. We're kind of done with that. And so there's a new identity and a new way of existing here. So God does the same thing. He gets his people to their promised land. He gets them safe-ish from everybody around them. But this time he's not doing it through war. This time he's doing it almost through politicking, through just the strength of his message. Actually, Cyrus is, and we'll talk a lot more about it, persuaded by the strength and power of the message of and the person of God. God persuades instead of browbeats. Someone who's not an Israelite, which is more impressive. In terms of progressing ultimately toward what does the true Exodus look like, this is like, where is this going? This is a step forward, right? We've gone from violence to peace, which the true Exodus, right, when we depart the terrors and enemies of this world and safely cross over through the wilderness into the true promised land, there's an element of both of those things, right? There is an element of a war was fought by God and won by him that allows us to go free, as in the Exodus. But it does not manifest in the kind of violence that we see in Exodus either. It's, for our purposes, it ends up being a peaceful transition. And we are allowed to go in peace. Jesus Christ somehow both conquers his enemies and very much in the nature of war, and does so non-violently and in a way that brings only peace, and where we don't have to take up arms in a traditional sense. There's spiritual warfare, yeah, there is a form of warfare going on, but it is a peaceful kind of warfare. It is one we actually win through peace and not through conflict. So the Exodus is evolving as the people are evolving. And God, the image of God is evolving from warrior into something else. So we'll keep tracing that really cool kind of second pass at the Exodus. And this time around, also, the first time, if you remember, the way was not so straight and not so easy. The people were not bought in, and they wandered for 40 years, in fact. And it was, there was a lot, it was a big deal, right? The book of Exodus is largely about the period of wander. Because the people are more on board now, this is also not that. They don't do something to offend God within a few weeks of starting a journey that shouldn't have to be that long and find themselves in the wilderness for 40 years. The time in Babylon was sufficient, and then Persia in exile was sufficient for these people to draw closer to God, whereas that is not what happened to the Israelites in Egypt. In fact, well, they never really had that identity yet as people of God. So there God was having to shape and build them into his people. Here, they have realized in exile the importance of that thing that they had neglected. And as such, the journey back can be smooth this time, whereas it was rough before. So the return comes this time non-violently, and this time without long, arduous, meandering journey. And those themes continue with the Exodus given to us as well, right? It may seem like the road to heaven is long, winding, and full of turmoil. And it can be, right? I suppose in some sense, we kind of have the choice of what our way to heaven looks like, right? If we resist like the people of Egypt did, it could take a very long time, and we can go by a very circuitous route. But that's not what's available now. We have the option of getting our act together, accepting God, and taking the straight and easy road. And that's what's there and what's offered to all of us. And let's please do that one. Because wandering in the wilderness for 40 years when there's a road there that takes a few days is a little silly. Not saying that, we don't all tend to walk that long one sometimes, but it's a metaphor, it's an apt metaphor for the state of our spiritual lives. The union with God toward which we are all working is available instantly if we got our minds and our hearts right. There's no impediment to getting to our destination other than our own stubbornness. Anyway, if today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts, right? We talk constantly on that theme, so I won't keep drilling it in too much more. But here, then, the prophecy is about, this is a new version of the Exodus. It's not going to be like the old one. We're going to make this easy for you, and this isn't about turmoil and struggle. This is about peace and comfort and an easy and smooth journey. The people have grown in their relationship with God through both what they suffered when they had the kingdom and what they suffered when they lost it. This is a people God is regarding as having grown up some and grown closer to him. It's the first real sign of progress we've seen since the Exodus. Right? The people have kind of been stuck in a pattern, and a not healthy one at that, of constant disobedience and being brought back, and disobedience and being brought back. They're never going to return to exactly that pattern again when they get back. There's going to be now, truly, at the heart of this people, a core, a remnant that never loses what they gained in exile, that keeps the faith, that keeps devotion to God. Not everyone. There will still be, we'll see, there will still be a lot of turmoil, but it's not going to affect everyone. There are going to be people who say, moving forward, no, you all are doing what we did before, and you're wanting to please other foreign powers, and you're looking at your own self-interest, and you're looking at introducing worship of other gods and these things we're not supposed to do. We pass. We opt out of that. We're with God. We're gonna stay with God. And that remnant of people who do that create literally the culture and the cult, the religious practice from which comes Jesus Christ. So what we've built isn't the whole people. It'll be fascinating to see. We've built a core of the people here in exile that is strong enough in their faith to get through this next period without falling into that cycle of falling away and having to be called back, which changes how prophecy is going to work as well, because that cycle of prophecy has been tied to that cycle of disobedience. And now when you have this new thing that is more solid, more strong, then the way prophecy interacts with that is different than the way it interacts with God's going to have to come and get you all because none of you get this. And I wish some of you would understand this. There are going to be some of them now who get it. So anyway, moving forward, lots changing. This is the first foreshadowing, the first hint that something truly and fundamentally has changed in exile. That shows how important this exile truly was for the identity of these people. It created a new identity. It forged a new core to these people. And that's what we hope to see from our own strife as well, right? That it helps us also forge a stronger, more resilient core that can help hold us up in the face of things to come and help us keep our faith and our devotion to God through whatever comes in our life as well. And that's a call for all of us here as well. So, really cool themes, lots going on. God is going to be looking after his people, providing comfort, guidance, ease, peace. Those are new themes for us here for a while, and it will be fun to explore them. Here we get to the other key thematic piece here, changing the relationship with God, and identity of God, which will be themed through this section. The first part here we get into, it's fairly typical, it's very well written. You've got your whole, they shall mount up with wings like eagles thing. Maybe depending on where you go to church, we definitely hear that song a lot. Where I've been. So the benefits of God being on your side are now less, he's going to kill everybody who's mean to you, and more, he's going to lift you up, and not for violence, right? It's, again, we don't have this theme of violence here. Before, we wanted to establish our God is stronger than everybody else. We do it in terms of mighty arms and holding swords and murder. And now it's he'll lift you up, right? You won't get weary or tired, and you can push through, but it's not the sense of to conquer and kill your enemies so much as more energy, no weariness. God is power, but it's not power exercised against others. It's power just exercised as a thing in and of itself. Again, it's peaceful. but it's emphasizing again the power of God. And then the power of God for those who follow God still, just in a different manifestation, which is really interesting. In the second part, we start to tee up the idea of, this is where we start to see these people must, in exile, have, some of them at least, gotten in their head that some of these other gods they ran into also had some substance to them. And here we lay out, again, a non-murdery way of testing the validity of these other gods. If you remember back, second Isaiah here is not proposing the same kind of proof of these foreign gods as, for example, Elijah did. If you remember with Baal, there was the idea of, you all get your God to do something, I'll get my God to do something, the loser is murdered horribly. And that's what happened, right? There was still a proof or a contest about the legitimacy of God, but it came with much more violence. This one, again, non-violent, similar idea, but the test is different. It's, okay, get your guys together, prove it. Get them to do something goddish. Can they, predict anything? Can they, and again, it's not, can they get your enemies? It's just, hey, God's supposed to be all-knowing. Know something that a normal person couldn't know, and we'll start talking about the legitimacy of your God. It's transitioned from the realm of strength and might to knowledge, insight, which is very much in line with the shift of the prophets as well, right? We don't see stories of Deutero-Isaiah out there murdering hundreds of prophets of these gods that we're not even dignifying with names now. We dignify Baal with a name like he was this thing that we were having to fight against. We don't care what the names of these gods in exile are, because we're moving more and more toward an idea of maybe they're fake. We'll get into that. So now you're not proving the might of your God against the might of the God of Israel. You're proving the legitimacy of your God as a thing that even is. And that's a different contest. It's not a contest of let's fight it out, God against God. It's a contest of prove that this is a thing. Prove your God is. And then we can talk about whose is better. But let's start with, is your God? Not, is your God better? And if you can't clear that bar, then we're not going to worry so much about it. So, again, shift away from violence as the thing that God helps you with toward knowledge and insight, showing that the people also have become, in exile, a bit more erudite, a bit more sophisticated. Remember who went first into exile were some of the upper classes. They dedicated themselves to reading and study of the law, reading, writing, study of the law. In exile, a new educated class emerged here. And so knowledge and insight becomes more important than military might. And that stays as a key identity of these people through to the Jewish people today. That identity persists. So, big deal, big shift. We're going to see more about that. God's still very important, just how we test God and how we look for him to help us, different from before. Building on the theme, this, in the style of 2nd Isaiah, is one that talking about loses some of the poignancy of just reading it. It's beautiful. What's it say? We'll talk about it anyway, because that's what we're here to do. Few points. The one that I think is most interesting, what is God calling these people again? They come out of exile, and they have been before that very much Judah. Here, they are Jacob and they are Israel. Why? Those are very loaded terms, Jacob and Israel, in the Old Testament, and they can mean 4 or 5 different things in various contexts. Obviously, in case some of you don't remember, Jacob and Israel are the same person, the son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham, father of the 12 guys who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. For a long time, the people all together were called by the name of Israel. Then when the kingdom split, the northern kingdom was called Israel and the southern kingdom was called Judah. So the north also got deported, not to Babylon. And so it's an interesting thing to hear the name coming back here. One thing we know this is not referring to is just that northern part that was called Israel. God is not speaking to just the deported north. That much is obvious. I think the inclusion of not just Israel but Jacob helps us see here what is intended, which is very much God seems to be talking to all of his people. This is, although he's maybe not going and finding all of the scattered people from the north, he's not excluding them either. This is kind of a broad promise that is specifically, he's working more toward the remnant of the tribe of Judah, but he's not necessarily excluding any of the people who received his promise. And we see that in the mind of God, this is his whole people are allowed in this promise of, I'm still your God. I'm still right. We can break covenants with God. He never does. If he says, you will be my people and I will be your God, he means you will be my people and I will be your God. Not, unless you really screw it up and then I'm out. Although it manifested that way in practice, we see here from the viewpoint of the prophets that God still sees all of them as his people. And so what he's doing is an opportunity for all of them. But he never wanted a divided kingdom to begin with. And now when he is in this theme of peace and unity, he's not going to reestablish this 2 kingdoms nonsense. He's not going to bring back Israel and Judah to continue to have 2 competing kingdoms of his people fighting against one another. He's bringing back 1 kingdom. And we saw the true lineage, heritage, heir was in the south, in Judah. The true line of David. And so we are taking the holy city of David, where God built his temple and took up his residence. That's where he wants to rebuild. So we're going to have New Jerusalem, rebuilt Jerusalem. New Jerusalem potentially means something else. We are going to rebuild Jerusalem and the kingdom around it. But it's available for any Israelite who is interested in participating, in returning. God is not making separations or divisions, but the Israelites are going to have to be willing to cross that line and live in the kingdom geographically of Judah, where they were not. So they're going to have to get over that separation to come back, which is another barrier for them potentially. But it is, to God's mind, everyone is available, or is welcomed and a part of this promise. And then the rest of this is a beautiful idea of God loves his people above all people. He is working to bring about their safety, their salvation, barriers, obstacles, hurdles. He will help them overcome. Again, not conquering enemies. It's floods and fires, not Hittites and Ammonites and whatever other people are around, Philistines. It's not plowing a way through people anymore violently. It is overcoming the obstacles of nature and reality itself. And then also, do throw in there at the end a little bit, I may have to make it go badly for some other people to make it go well with you, but it's still not in a military sense. It's, Egypt, Ethiopia, Seba, we might have to, it might not be great to be them, but, you're not them, and you're the people of God. And that remains true, right? Like, it is necessary if God is to anoint, to sanctify, to lift out his people. By definition, a thing that is holy is set apart. You need the thing that it is set apart from for it to be set apart. If everything came along, there's no division, there's no separation. The idea is that the thing that's set apart eventually draws in everything else, but that's down the road. The first part is you set apart a thing, you draw boundaries, and you deal with the thing that is sanctified, that is set apart. And for the rest of it, almost by definition, you're not dealing, not almost, by definition, you're not dealing with in the same way. So when God rededicates and creates his people, things aren't going to be as good for the people who aren't his people. And that pains God, right? It's not his ideal that just these people fare well and all those other people don't. And he's saying, I love you, my people, so much that I'm willing for now to, leave them to their own devices and to focus on you. But you need to get your act together so you can go get them. Because we're not trying to leave them behind, but you're up first. And that's where we're at with our church today as well. Right? There is still now today a group of people that is consecrated to and set apart for God. And that doesn't mean God loves the other people less when he leaves them a bit to their own devices. And in fact, it's our job now to go get them and help bring them into the fold, just the same as here. So in a temporary sense, it is almost necessary that some people be left behind, but that is not God's goal, nor is it his vision. So he works through a few people that he chooses and works with, but he's working toward inclusion of everyone. And I think you can see that begin here, but it very much persists and is still our mission today. Here we reiterate, and as just an important note for Bible study, I cannot stress enough, when you see, and there aren't that many of them, an instance where God says he's doing a new thing, that is a very important thing to look at. I have too often sort of glossed over that as, oh, God's doing new things all the time, it's not a big deal. He really isn't. It's not that often that a new thing happens. The last one that I can remember being this explicit is when the kingship was established. And again, that's one that's super easy to read over. But if you remember back to our United Kingdom study, we spent a lot of time on it. You probably remember. If not, we have studies on the United and Divided Kingdoms that are very worth checking out. So a new thing is happening. I think we've probably set up fairly well some of what that is and looks like. But to reiterate, I think one of the defining things, there's a sense of a second Exodus that is an old thing done again. The part of it that is new is the radical departure away from violence and toward peace. Cannot emphasize enough, that's weird for these people. They have been all about the violence, and now they're not going to be all about the violence. It's like an entirely different kingdom when they get back. Now there's conflict, and there is fighting with the neighbors, but it's not the same. It's not a people, they don't go into the promised land conquering. right? When the people first arrive in the Promised Land, they do so at the head of an army, and they have to conquer every bit of the land that is given to them. It's given to them to take, not to just have. This time, by great miracle, it is given to them to just have. They don't have to go, they do have to defend it a little bit once they get there, but they don't have to take it. It's just given. Peace. How on earth is that achieved? It boggles the mind how that could be. And it's done by heathens, by non-believers, oversee and allow that. It's unfathomable. We've seen so many iterations of, my favorite one, of this thing where something happens in two passes in the scriptures. And the first one is violent and death-focused. And the second one is peaceful and comes with life. My favorite one is the comparison between the prophets Elijah and Elisha. And we see it takes double the power of Elijah to do things the way Elisha does, to do them with peace. So Elijah goes around and basically murders anybody who gets in the way. And most of his miracles involve drought, death, desolation. There's an instance where he brings someone back to life, but by and large, what he's doing is concerned not with life, but with death. And then Elisha comes in and achieves many of the same things, but he doesn't kill people to do it. Enemy forces come in and they get confounded and confused and led outside of town without ever attacking. That takes more power than the other way. That is a greater act of God. Although it's easy to see, and I think human nature, we're somewhat programmed to look at the manifestations of violence as being the powerful thing. The message is the opposite. The message is it is a greater work of God to do this without violence. And it is a new thing to to rebuild the foundations of these people and this kingdom from peace instead of from violence. We're starting over. We're saying that didn't work, right? Like this first pass, this version that we did violently, ended in violence. So, of course it would, right? That makes intuitive sense. So, if we want the outcome to be peace, let us begin again in peace. So we're going to a newer and a better place. We need a new foundation, a new beginning. We're doing a new thing. And a thing that we spend too much time focusing, maybe, and possibly it's in ignorance of the history of these people. We give too much credit to the Exodus and too little to this return as a significant event in the history of these people. Because this is a greater work of God than the Exodus. Much greater. I'm not sure I really need to say much else on it other than a part of me wants to just sit quiet a minute to let that sink in. This is a big deal. And again, whenever you see, I am doing a new thing, stop and think, what makes this different? What makes it new? What isn't like it was before? And why? It matters. So, new thing here, the big key difference being we're doing it this time without violence. Here again we have more beautiful prose, very worth reading. Less need potentially for comment, though again there are a few things definitely worth pulling out. Glossed over it a little bit before. This is a good point to comment on the idea of redemption. Remember, these people are now in captivity. What is redemption? It is the idea of buying back. So there's a sense, literally, so there's a sense that a debt has been incurred. We talk a lot about we use phrases like that metaphorically a lot. Oh, a debt has been incurred, and we don't think, no, like, I owe you, like, literally, I owe you some sort of recompense, payback, redemption. As a result, it's not just, I owe you some vague thing later, but like currency, value needs to exchange hands now. You are owed value from me. Money might not be, strictly speaking, it, but substance value, something is owed, right? God doesn't want from us money. But money is also, right, just honestly kind of a fake construct, right, that we all agree is representative of, but not itself containing value. The important point of what it represents is that value of what we can produce, what we can generate, what can be offered by us. The fruit of our efforts, which is what the people were not really giving to God before. And so redemption, they owe a debt. They owe all that time where what they were producing, what they were working toward, what they were generating was not going toward God. They owe him that which has not been given. And they have been taken into exile as a result of a debt that has not been paid. And being in exile doesn't make it easier to pay. But they're not the ones who are paying it. God takes care of it. The important point there for us is that still is true, right? We all of us have owed a debt that we do not have the means of paying, that God has paid for us. Doesn't say that debt is forgiven, just that it's been paid. There's kind of a new debtor, right? We are now indebted literally to God, who has redeemed us, right? He comes and gets us out of the situation that we're in where we owe this debt. We still owe it. We just owe it to a party who's far more reasonable about terms of repayment. But he's not forgiving the debt. We owe God. We owe God more than we can ever repay him. And terms are very reasonable and favorable, but he hasn't wiped it out to the point that he said, no, you don't owe me anything. I think there is a thought among some people practicing Christianity that that's what it means, right? Oh, my sins are forgiven. I don't owe anyone anything. No. There is a cost to what has been given to us, and we still owe in exchange for the cost that has been paid. It's just not owed under such onerous terms that it will literally be the death of us. We have gotten far more favorable terms, and we've been given a much longer period of time in which to pay them, as long as we are, making our regular payments. But if we start missing our payments, then the terms can get a lot less favorable again. You owe regular payment on the debt that you still owe to God. He bought it out, but you owe him, as do these people. That's the idea of redemption, is he bought out our debt at great cost. And that's an important way to think of it. It's weird to think about a relationship with God using the metaphor of a financial transaction, but here it is. And it is instructive. So, redemption. Key point, still very important in the idea of Christianity as well as for the people here. And significantly important that we're talking about God as a redeemer and not as a forgiver of debt. It's transfer, not a waiving. And we all have debts that we owe. Other key point here is, and I anticipated this some, so it's not coming as new here, we introduced the idea of Cyrus. And more importantly, the idea of Cyrus as serving the purpose of God. Cyrus is God's shepherd. and he is building Jerusalem and the temple. The last time a king did that, he was a very big deal king in the history of God's people. The last, I guess it was a series, because the promise was made to David, but Solomon did it. David built the city. You're talking about the company of David and Solomon when you're talking about somebody who is God's shepherd. What did David do? And who is building the temple. Promise made to David, Solomon did it. Arguably shouldn't have, but was trying to hone in on the promise made to his dad, and building the city. This is a big deal. And it's a bigger deal because this is not a Jewish king, an Israelite king. This is a king of Judah. This is a heathen. And we'll talk much more about how some of this comes about, and we'll get to look at the book of Daniel and some other cool things about all of this. But again, easy thing to read over, very big deal. There are pretty blatant comparisons to David being made about Cyrus, and not accidentally. And you know, if you think about it, if you're the people that are allowed to just leave being a captive and go back to your home and to rebuild, you're going to be very fond of the guy who lets you do that. He deserves credit for that. That is a huge, and again, unprecedented thing, right? It's not Pharaoh saying, oh, I changed my mind. I'm not going to let these people go after all. I'm going to send out my army and get them. After I had to be strongly persuaded to let them go to begin with. This is Cyrus just saying, yeah, go, here's a bunch of money if you need it on the way, and you're free, and if anybody hassles you, let me know and I'll take care of it. This is, again, unprecedented, and it's a new founding of Jerusalem and Judah, and the king is, and remember, the king kind of stands in the position of God for these people, is not of their faith. It's an interesting thing. We'll see it develop more. But it's coming up now, and it is very worth looking at further. Two big things to talk about with this section. The first one, continuing from where we left off, is Cyrus. Here we see explicitly Cyrus referred to as God's anointed one. Again, big deal. And we see a lot of the things that God is going to do for and through Cyrus. We also see why. And that's where this gets interesting. The reason is not ultimately any different than why God gave prosperity to the likes of David or Solomon either. It's not for the sake of the king, it's for the sake of God's chosen people. A fascinating thing about the kingship is that it's come to a point where it can serve exactly the same purpose for these people, whether or not the king is actually one of them. It does the same thing. You can protect the people, you can guarantee and uphold the religious practice. It has separated enough from, all the bad behavior from the core of the religious practice, right? When David started, they were very much one and the same thing. And that was part of Saul's problem, right? In the later days of the kingdom, Saul would have been a pretty good king. But in the early days, when the king was expected to be a true religious leader as well, Saul was a train wreck. Because he couldn't, and specifically because he couldn't do the religious leading part of it. He didn't do so bad at the other leading part of it. Once he got into the swing of things and decided to actually be a king, he was okay administratively and militarily. He was just bad religiously. And in the beginning, that was not okay. Later on, that's entirely okay. Because the expectation of what the king was changed. And so now you can come to a point where a king can serve all of the political and administrative functions and guarantee or allow the practice of the religious side of things sufficiently that the king doesn't have to even be of the same religious beliefs and tradition and ethnicity even. He doesn't have to be one of the people to serve well the function of a king because it's changed so much. Again, Saul would be fine at this, but Cyrus is better because, his kingdom is a lot more powerful. It actually works out better to have somebody in charge of a much larger and more powerful kingdom than yours also calling himself your king. Here you see also an evolution in the mindset of these people. They needed so badly to have their own king. When God said, "This is a bad idea. Do you really need it?" And they said, "Oh no, we have to have a king to be like other people. Or how can we get by?" They don't really have a king now. Not of theirs, right? They now are answerable to foreign powers. They'll have rulers and administrators, and there will be kings over them, and even eventually sort of their people, but it's never going to be like it was before again. The king or the ruler over the people will pretty much always be some version of an outsider from here on out. And that's okay. And this is the people coming to terms with this. This is as you needed David as God's anointed king to establish the precedent for what that version of the kingship was supposed to look like, and every future king in that version of things was answerable to, is he doing this like David did? So too is Cyrus for this next phase. And every future foreign ruler over these people is to be compared to, is this person like Cyrus was? And so you're setting another precedent, and it really is like the anointing of David, and you're establishing with God's help and cooperation, a new line of what it means to rule his people in his place. Let us not forget, the king is taking the place of God for these people. That was the deal to begin with, is God was their king, and they wanted another one. This is what it means to be doing a good job standing in the place of God for these people, when not being one of them is Cyrus. And that'll be the reference point. And so we see God works with Cyrus and allows him to flourish and thrive in all the things that he's doing for the sake of this small part of his kingdom that he's going to oversee the way God wants him to. And we will continue to see, especially when we get to books of the Maccabees, how international politics relate to these people. You can make a very interesting case based on the precedent here set with Cyrus for God continuing to favor and bring about positive geopolitical results for the people that are going to help bring about the right circumstances for his kingdom, up to and including there's a version of looking at Roman history leading to Caesar Augustus that you can look at through the lens of allowing for Jesus Christ and the things that happen. And you can take this argument here made with Cyrus and you can overlay it onto some of what happens with the Greeks and the Seleucids and the Romans, and some of the things that we'll see happen. And you can see the same developments of who gets in charge and when and how they're treating this small little kingdom being a part of how they fare on this giant and massive stage. From that point of view, and this is not an historical interpretation, this is a religious one, you could argue that and probably should, that God allowed and helped to build the Roman Empire for the sake of Jesus Christ. Which makes it not at all inappropriate that the now center of our church is Rome and not Jerusalem. But it's a fascinating thing to think about, and this is that precedent, right? The first anointed non-Israelite king of Israel, Cyrus here, sets the precedent that will one day lead to Augustus Caesar and all of what that kingdom did and meant also for the Holy Land and Jesus Christ. Anyway, fascinating thing happening here. We'll talk through some of that history farther into this study as well, so I won't go into all of it now, but new thing happening again. This idea of an anointed foreign king is new and massive and cool. And major shift in how things are going to be for God's people. So worth calling to mind, and we'll definitely come back to it a lot. In this section, we see the culmination of a theme that through this lesson we've kind of been building on. It started a little subtly. It was in the last section, but we had a lot more to talk about with anointed kings and all of that. This is sort of the high point of, there's a new idea of God as he relates to other gods now. Old way of looking at it, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. Decent rule. Implication, sort of leaving on the table the gods. Okay, that works for a while. Now, we're saying, are there other gods? Prove it. And if there aren't, then you don't get to have gods. You have to have God. And if you can't prove that any of these other gods are real, then they have to go away entirely, which is really important considering what happened to how religious practice worked for these people, right? Even when they were trying to put God first, when they had all of these other practices that sort of vaguely coexisted in their society, they led to bad things. It was all over the place, but one of the examples was, the crops aren't growing as well as the people want, so they think, well, here's a fertility and a crop god. We'll just set up a little shrine here on the hill. With God, we still worship God, but we need those crops to grow. So, fertility god, could you see to our crops? And it's a slippery slope, right? You start allowing or introducing some of these other practices kind of to hedge your bets religiously. You're not all in on God then, right? Like, even if you're attempting to put him first, you're not all in on it. And then also, there's the idea you can't, they're fake. No other way to say it. Like, how can you serve truth when you are dedicating any part of yourself to things that are false? What is it? Is it one of the Psalms, or maybe it'll come up later? I don't remember the passage. They devoted themselves to worship of things that are false, and they themselves became false. Or maybe we talked about it earlier in one of these studies, actually. I don't remember. But that's the key idea here of you can't be doing that, right? To the extent that you are taking a part of your devotion and giving it over to things that are fake, you are outside of the truth, and God is truth. And you have to... And we're way more about God being an intellectual, an understood thing, a knowledge-based, and a reason-based thing, and not a fighting-based thing. And with that comes the need for purging these things that are fake, that are in contrary to God from an intellectual level. And so now we're starting to say, prove it. And unless you can, not only can you not have those other gods equal to me, you can't have them. There are no other gods. Go ahead, if you disagree, prove it, and we'll rework this. But you can't because they're fake. And so get rid of them. There can be no other gods, which is a strengthening of the first commandment, which is really important when you're rebuilding your society that failed at adhering to the first commandment. Right? Like, no, if you were to rank the commandments in order of importance, it's maybe not 1 through 10, but it's definitely 1, and then 2 through 10. And maybe 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4 through... The beginning of the list is definitely the most important part of the list, and 1 is definitely the most important one of the ones on the list. And if you're not adhering to that, the rest of it doesn't actually matter. So, as we are rebuilding and refounding the kingdom, we're also refounding practice. And we're doing that on the basis of a strengthening of the first commandment. And we're getting rid of the parts of that that led to problem, any confusion about how other gods fit in. And so we're saying, here's how other gods fit in. They don't. Period. End of story. No other gods. Not set up an altar, but it's not in Jerusalem. Not only this time of year. Not a little bit. None. 0. Not any. Can't have it. Again, very important. Shows a shift in the mentality and the mindset. It's now looking back, shocking to us that other rites and religious practices coexisted with the worship of God, but they did. This is where they shouldn't have. There was a sense in which they shouldn't have, but for a long time they did. This is where that stopped, and continues to have stopped. And from this time forward, for the people of Israel and Judah, and for us, it has become unacceptable to put other things not just on the level with God, but in the same sphere at all. And that's where I think we hit problems with idolatry today. Isn't as often we being people who are trying to be good Christians and follow. I'm not commenting on the people who aren't trying at all and aren't believers. It's for those of us who are, like the people of Israel were in theory believers. It's when we put anything even in the same arena as God that we have a problem, right? You can think, God's important in my life, but you know, my job's pretty important. It's not the same level of importance. Like, of course, God is first and all that, but I'd really like my career to get to this point, and I'm going to put in a lot of time on that. And you know, okay, I have to work this Sunday, and I might have to miss Mass. But it's just this once, and usually I'm in serving God, but just this one time, like, the crops aren't growing, and I could use a little bit of help from a fertility god, but then I'll get back to it. It's the same kind of deal. If something gets into the arena of where God is, then it starts to compete, and then almost necessarily God won't always win. And that's where the challenge is getting everything out of that same level or arena as God. Not just God is first and then other things are secondary to God. God is first and nothing else is on the table at all. Has to be how it is. And that is, I think if we're honest with ourselves, very hard for us to do. And that's not how our society accepts Christianity. We live in what we call a Christian society, but we live in a Christian society only so long as we can put other things on the table with God. We're willing to have a society that coexists with God and these idols, like the Israelites did before exile. We're not willing to, and it's not acceptable or smooth sailing if you try to get rid of the other things and try to just make it God. That's not the Christian basis of our society, at least from my point of view. You're welcome to disagree, but from my point of view, you only get by smoothly in this Christian country if you have various other things that you have allowed onto the table with God. And if you try to clear those out and make only God your priority, I think you're going to hit some rough sailing here and there. God has told us over and over again that it will be. I don't think it's surprising. But it is an interesting challenge and an interesting thing to think about. We are comfortable trying to put God as first among many. We are not comfortable trying to put God as only. And that's what we're asked to do. And the other way doesn't work. It didn't work. It leads to exile and calamity, as it turns out. And the call is to rebuild our society, our kingdom, our lives on the singular foundation of only God. I understand that's easy to say and not easy to do. I'm not saying I'm doing it. I'm not. But that's what this is asking us to do. And if we, from this lesson, take away one thing, I think there are many in here that are worth reflecting on, but if there's one that's worth thinking about, it's that one. What else maybe do we let get on the same, let compete with God in our lives? And how do we get those things out of the way? Because strictly speaking, they're fake. And they can't prove that they have substance in the grand scheme of things, because they don't. And God is real, and anything else that we're putting there honestly isn't. It can seem like it. You wonder how did they think the Baals and the Asherah and all these things were real? Well, how do you think money is real? Money is not real. It seems like it, and it can yield some benefit to you, but so could worshiping Baals. It doesn't make them real. There is not a thing, money, that is actually, I mean, especially now that it's not even held into gold currency. It's a number in a computer somewhere. It's not a real thing. And so anyway, ranting, but so much so with some of these other things, we try to, and we treat them like they're realer than they are. And that helps us justify having them compete with God. We try to make God less real than he is and make these other things more real than they are to try to get them closer to one another, to try to justify having them closer to one another in our lives. And that leads us very far astray, as it did to these people. So, God alone, everything else is fake. At this point, the theme is pretty well established. Couple points. One, peace. Oh, that you had listened, then your peace would have been like a river, not you would have conquered all of those around you and won all of your battles, which is pretty much how that message used to go. Now it's you would have had peace if you had listened. And you're listening now, so we can still, the other part of that message is we can still do that and are planning to still do that. So we didn't, for a while here, do that, but we're planning to do that. As before, when the people were out of favor with God, the threat was of violence coming. Now when they're moving into favor with God, it's not a threat anymore, it's a promise, is of peace. And from this point on, that pretty much stays the message. With worship and service of God comes peace. And with not worship of God comes strife and conflict. there'll be places where that gets a little complicated. There will definitely be some murder done in the name of God down the road, but it's not going to be so much murder of just people who happen to be your enemies roundabout. It's going to be much more targeted toward people who are kind of leading you astray. And it'll be interesting. The Maccabees are great for that. We'll get to some of that. But general idea, peace comes with the worship and service of God, not conquest, peace, which is a much more comforting idea and a much stronger promise. And again, the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob, right? Like, we're going back towards something good now. We've been in bad times, good times coming. So maybe it takes us just a little bit to get totally out of this realm of, oh, arm of the Lord, after I've been spending the whole lesson talking about we don't do that anymore. We do have just a little bit of hearkening back to that, which it's language ingrained in their way of viewing and looking at God. But as you keep reading the section, you see, although it starts with some of that old invocation, it does not actually talk about God conquering enemies. It doesn't go on with where it usually ended. It's just in the initial call. It's hard to get over a way of thinking about things. Maybe it's, was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? But now it's not, so do that again. Now it's, let's just go back. If you could do that, let's just get us back. The call is not one of violence. The recollection is, but the current call is not. And it is very much bringing of joy and removing of sorrow. That's back to where we're at. But it was funny that we immediately had one of those old calls that I was saying we've moved away from. Anyway, peace, prosperity, joy. Certainly for those of us interested in Bible study, this is a passage I suspect we've probably seen before and thought some about. Key points. We're focusing not on the negatives of not turning toward God, but on the positives of doing so. We're not focused on violence and calamity. We're focused on mercy and pardon, on the positive and not the negative side. That's the mindset of 2nd Isaiah, which is part of what makes this prophet so beautiful. He doesn't see God as an avenger, as a punisher. He sees God as merciful and bringing redemption. And so instead of presenting God's message as a threat, he presents it as a promise and a thing of hope. And in doing so, he reminds us, my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. You all tend to think of things in terms of, got to get them. That's not God's interest. His interest is finding a way to pardon you, to make things smooth, to make things easy. God wants for you better than you want for yourself. But he knows how to get you there, and you don't. So you need to listen. How do you listen? You need him to speak to you in order to listen. And that's where we come to the end of this lesson. And we see the importance of the study of God's Word. God speaks to us in order that we might listen. He does it in a number of ways. It's very easy to see this last part about God sending his word forth from his mouth as looking forward to the coming of Jesus Christ, as we should. The fourth gospel begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In that context, this is very much talking about Jesus Christ. But it is also talking about, it's definitely talking about the message here of the prophets and of the study of the Scriptures as well. And beyond that, it has so much more application than that. If you think about it, Anything where God's breath is can also contain his word, right? Breath is the underlying element that allows for speech, right? You have to breathe in order to make sounds and to communicate words. It's not the only part necessary, but it's one. And as such, God also speaks his word through all of us, as he has shared his spirit, his breath with all of us. And we help shape and form that spirit into expressions of God's words ourselves. So it manifests in a lot of different ways, right? And they're all important. But the idea, and the key idea, is listen. God speaks everywhere if you just listen. And learn to identify what is the Word of God versus what isn't. And that's where some of this previous idea we've seen about getting out of your life those things that aren't God, those things that are false, matters. When you're mired in things that are false, you cannot recognize the truth. But as you get those false things out of your life, you can come more and more to recognize and to hear the truth and to learn to recognize God's word when you see it. And why does that matter? This passage tells us because God's trying to give us peace and comfort. And we don't know how to get to those things on our own. So we need to be told the way. And we have to learn to recognize and to hear what that is so we can find our way. And that's why we're doing any of this Bible study, right? It's interesting in and of itself. There's a lot here that's fun as an intellectual exercise, but that's not really the goal, I hope. The goal is we are trying to find a way to live a better, more fulfilling, eternally meaningful, and joyful life. And the thought is that in doing this well, it can help us to get to that goal. And that seems like a good place to end this particular lesson. We'll get more into it next time. This has been an overview of Lesson 7 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written studies and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.